Karoline Leavitt settled into her first-class seat, adjusting the small gold cross necklace that rested just above her collarbone. It was a simple gesture, something she had done countless times before. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, greeting passengers and offering drinks. It was the usual pre-flight routine, until one of them stopped in front of her. The woman, a flight attendant with a rigid posture and a forced smile, wasn't looking at Karoline. Her eyes were fixed on the necklace. "Miss, we like to keep the atmosphere welcoming for everyone," the attendant said, her tone light but unmistakably pointed. "Some passengers might find that a bit inappropriate." Karoline blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" The smile didn't falter, but the intent behind it was clear. "We just try to avoid displays that could make others uncomfortable." A hush fell over the surrounding passengers. Some glanced up from their phones, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. A few leaned in slightly, subtly listening. One person was already holding their phone at an angle, recording. Karoline sat up straighter. "You're telling me that wearing a cross is making people uncomfortable?" The attendant's smile remained frozen, but Karoline noticed a slight shift in her posture, the way her fingers tightened against the serving tray she held. "I'm just asking for cooperation, Miss Leavitt." That was when Karoline realized. This wasn't about airline policy. It wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about something else entirely. And in that moment she knew. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a test. The air inside the first-class cabin grew heavier, thick with a silent tension that spread with every second. Karoline remained seated, her fingers lightly resting against the cross on her chest. Her mind raced, not with doubt but with certainty. This was not just an overzealous flight attendant enforcing some vague rule. This was something deeper, something deliberate. She met the woman's gaze head-on. "Are you saying religious jewelry is against airline policy?" The attendant hesitated, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "It's not about policy," she said, her voice a little less sure this time. "It's about maintaining a welcoming environment for all passengers." A few seats away, a businessman lowered his newspaper, watching intently. Across the aisle, a woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. People were paying attention now. Karoline let the silence stretch before speaking. "So let me get this straight. You're singling me out because I'm wearing a cross? If I were wearing a different religious symbol, would we be having this conversation?" The attendant stiffened. She knew this was spiraling beyond her control. "Miss Leavitt, I'm trying to keep this from becoming a problem," she said, her voice now carrying a hint of warning. "If you could just—" "You wouldn't say this to someone wearing a hijab or a Star of David," a deep voice interrupted from 2 rows back. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged glances. Others looked outright appalled. Someone whispered, "This is ridiculous," while another quietly pulled out their phone and started recording. The flight crew had noticed the disruption now. A lead supervisor, her uniform crisp with the stripes of authority, made her way down the aisle. She looked from the first attendant to Karoline, assessing the situation with quiet calculation. "What seems to be the issue here?" the supervisor asked. Before Karoline could answer, the first attendant jumped in. "Miss Leavitt's necklace is causing discomfort for some passengers." A beat of silence. The supervisor's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered first to the gold cross, then back to the nervous face of the attendant. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A camera phone just barely peeked over a seatback, capturing every detail. Then, finally, the supervisor spoke. "You're welcome to wear your necklace, Miss Leavitt." The attendant's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but stopped herself at the last second. The moment hung in the air, thick and unshakable. Karoline didn't need to say another word. The passengers had already done it for her. The first-class cabin was no longer just a place of quiet luxury. It had become a stage, and everyone was watching. The supervisor's words still hung in the air, an undeniable confirmation that Karoline had every right to wear her cross. But the damage had already been done. The first attendant, the one who had initiated the confrontation, stood frozen. Her face, once composed with an air of quiet authority, was now rigid, her lips slightly parted as if she was searching for a rebuttal that wouldn't come. The ripple of murmurs among the passengers had grown into a steady hum, voices whispering in disbelief. "You really tried to police someone's faith in first class," a voice called out, louder this time. Karoline remained still, letting the weight of the moment settle. She could feel the eyes on her, the cameras rolling, the glances exchanged between passengers. The first attendant had walked into this believing she held all the power, but now she was the one being judged. The tension tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. The supervisor, sensing the unease crackling through the air, turned toward the attendant. "That will be all," she said, her tone firm but carrying an undertone of disapproval. The attendant swallowed hard. "I was only trying to—" "We're done here," the supervisor interrupted, her voice clipped. For the first time, true panic flashed across the attendant's face. She had miscalculated. What had begun as an attempt to single Karoline out had backfired spectacularly, and now the entire cabin had turned against her. A passenger across the aisle leaned forward, his phone now deliberately raised. "Hope you're proud of yourself," he muttered. The attendant sucked in a sharp breath, her hands tightening into fists before she finally stepped back. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked swiftly toward the galley, her posture stiff, her composure shattered. The moment she disappeared, a low but unmistakable wave of quiet applause rippled through the cabin. Karoline inhaled deeply, then exhaled, slow and controlled. She wasn't angry. No, anger would have been too easy. What she felt was something deeper, something heavier. The flight wasn't over yet, but one thing was clear: by the time they landed, this story wouldn't just stay inside this cabin. It was already bigger than that. The hush that had settled over the first-class cabin was anything but peaceful. It was heavy, thick with unspoken words and electric with tension. The flight attendant who had tried to force Karoline into removing her cross was gone, retreating to the galley like a soldier defeated in battle. But the effects of her actions lingered like a stain on the air. Karoline could feel it: the stares, the whispers, the shifting glances between passengers who had just witnessed something they knew wasn't right. She adjusted her posture, sitting up straighter. She had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. A man 2 rows ahead spoke up, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around him. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "They'd never say that to someone wearing another religious symbol." A woman beside him nodded, her face twisted in disbelief. "Exactly. I don't even go to church, but this is wrong." Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching since the beginning leaned forward, locking eyes with Karoline. "Do you realize what just happened?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "That wasn't just about a necklace. That was an attempt to humiliate you." Karoline met his gaze, unwavering. "I know." Another ripple of movement. More phones out, more messages being typed, more footage being uploaded. The story had already taken flight, long before the plane would land. The lead supervisor, sensing the tension still crackling in the air, stepped closer, clearing her throat. "Miss Leavitt," she began, her voice carefully measured. "I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of the airline for any misunderstanding." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" The supervisor's carefully constructed expression faltered, if only for a second. She knew she had chosen the wrong word. "An error in judgment," she corrected. "I can assure you, the airline does not condone discrimination of any kind." Karoline didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "I appreciate the apology," Karoline finally said. "But let's be honest here. If no one had spoken up, if passengers hadn't recorded this, would you be standing here right now?" The supervisor inhaled, clearly struggling to find the right response. She glanced around the cabin, sensing that the passengers were waiting for her answer just as much as Karoline was. A long pause, then finally a quiet admission. Probably not. There it was, the truth. And just like that, the tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too tight. A murmur ran through the cabin, some in approval, others in sheer disbelief at the honesty of it all. Karoline nodded. At least you're willing to admit it. The supervisor straightened her posture. We'll be addressing this incident internally. I'm sure you will, Karoline said, her tone cool. The supervisor hesitated, then added, Can we offer you a complimentary drink or meal? The offer was almost laughable, as if a free drink could erase what had just transpired. Karoline gave her a small, knowing smile. No, thank you. The supervisor gave a stiff nod and walked away, but the damage was done, and everyone knew it. The rest of the flight passed in a strange, tense stillness. Some passengers tried to pretend as if nothing had happened, while others exchanged quiet discussions that carried the undercurrent of outrage. But Karoline knew this wasn't the end. Because by the time this plane touched down, this moment, this confrontation, would be seen by millions. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, but the atmosphere in first class was anything but smooth. The supervisor had walked away, her apology lingering in the air like an empty promise. The flight attendant who had started it all remained out of sight, no doubt realizing the gravity of her mistake. But for Karoline, the real storm was only beginning. The passengers were still buzzing, whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken earlier leaned toward her again. You know this is going viral already, right? His voice was low, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. Karoline nodded. She had known the second she saw the phones come out. A woman 2 rows behind her tapped on her arm gently. I just wanted to say, what happened to you was disgusting. You handled it with grace. Karoline gave her a small, appreciative nod. Thank you. But just as she started to think the situation was beginning to settle, another voice cut through the murmurs. Ms. Leavitt? She turned to see a man a few seats away, his expression unreadable. He held up his phone, the screen aglow with a social media feed that refreshed at an alarming rate. I think you might want to see this. Karoline took the phone from his outstretched hand. The headline glaring back at her was exactly what she had expected. But seeing it in real time sent a fresh wave of energy through her veins. Breakout, Karoline Leavitt target on flight over religious symbol. You won't believe what happened next. Beneath it, comments were already flooding in. This is what happens when you don't bow to their agenda. So now wearing a cross is offensive? What's next? Karoline, stay strong. We're with you. That flight attendant needs to be fired. Her name was already trending. The clip, captured from multiple angles, was spreading like wildfire. Different media outlets were picking it up, each one spinning the event in its own way. Some framed it as an attack on religious freedom, others as an abuse of airline power. The businessman smirked. Told you. Karoline exhaled, steadying herself. She knew this was bigger than just a flight incident. It was a moment, a defining moment that was about to take on a life of its own. And somewhere in the galley, the flight attendant who had started it all had likely just realized her career might never be the same again. The tension inside the cabin had reached an unbearable peak. Karoline could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she remained composed, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, the businessman who had shown her the article was still scrolling through the endless flood of reactions. Every second, new comments poured in, fueling the fire that had already spread far beyond this flight. Passengers exchanged glances, some excited, others uneasy. They knew they were witnessing something much larger than an in-flight disagreement. This was turning into a national conversation, and they were sitting in the front row. Then, the unexpected happened. The flight attendant, the one who had confronted Karoline about her cross, appeared at the front of the cabin, her face noticeably paler than before. She clutched a tablet in her hand, her fingers visibly trembling as she approached the supervisor. Their hushed conversation was tense, their body language stiff. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. A few moments later, the supervisor cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your cooperation during this flight. We want to ensure that all passengers have a comfortable experience." Her eyes flicked toward Karoline for just a second, then back to the rest of the cabin. "We recognize that a situation occurred earlier, and we sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding." A murmur rippled through the passengers, some scoffing, others whispering in disbelief. It was a half-hearted attempt at damage control, and everyone knew it. But then came the real moment of reckoning. A voice from the back of first class, deep, authoritative, cut through the murmurs. "That's it! A misunderstanding!" The flight supervisor hesitated. Karoline turned her head slightly, trying to see who had spoken. A man in a navy suit, tall and composed, leaned forward in his seat. His piercing gaze was locked onto the flight crew. She was singled out, disrespected, and now this airline wants to sweep it under the rug? The whispers turned into full conversations. More passengers spoke up, voicing their discontent. "This is unacceptable. She deserves a real apology. Why did this even happen in the first place?" The flight attendant, the one responsible, looked like she wanted to disappear. Her eyes darted around the cabin, her breathing shallow. She had lost control, and now the very passengers she had once held authority over were turning against her. Karoline took a deep breath and finally spoke. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "I appreciate the apology," she said, making sure the entire cabin could hear her. "But the issue here isn't just a misunderstanding. It's about respect." The cabin fell silent again, all eyes on her. And just like that, the airline's attempt at damage control had failed. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The air inside the cabin had turned thick with anticipation. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Waiting for something more than a weak corporate apology. Waiting for accountability. The supervisor's vague statement had only added fuel to the fire, and now everyone knew the airline had no easy way out. Karoline sat still, her posture straight, her expression unwavering. She had handled the situation with grace, but the fight wasn't over. Across from her, the businessman smirked, shaking his head. "They're scrambling," he murmured, tilting his phone slightly so she could see yet another headline. "Airline under fire after attempting to shame passenger for her faith." The story was evolving in real time. News outlets were picking up the footage, online commentators were dissecting every second of the confrontation, and now, like clockwork, the airline was realizing just how badly they had miscalculated. Then, the unexpected happened. A ding from the intercom cut through the tension. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, slow and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We appreciate your patience. I've been made aware of a situation that took place earlier in the flight, and I want to personally assure you that our airline does not condone discrimination of any kind." Murmurs spread across the cabin like wildfire. The captain, someone who rarely got involved in passenger disputes, was stepping in. That meant one thing: damage control at the highest level. The flight supervisor shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the first attendant, the one who had started it all. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the serving tray as if holding on to the last thread of control. Then the captain spoke again, and his next words sent a shockwave through the cabin. "To the passenger affected, I'd like to extend a direct apology on behalf of the airline." A brief pause, then, "Ms. Leavitt, we regret any disrespect shown to you today." Gasps, audible, undeniable. The passengers looked at each other, stunned. Airline captains rarely, if ever, got personally involved in incidents like this. The businessman let out a low whistle. "Wow," he muttered. "That's the closest thing to an admission of guilt you're ever going to get." Karoline remained composed, but inside she knew what this meant. This was bigger than just an apology. This was an acknowledgement that they had lost control of the narrative, that the airline knew the second they landed this story would explode even further. The damage had already been done. And as Karoline met the eyes of the flight attendant, the woman who had tried to humiliate her, she saw something new. No longer arrogance, no longer defiance, just fear. Because now the whole world was watching. Standing firm in your beliefs. Lessons from Karoline Leavitt's experience. Karoline Leavitt's confrontation on the plane wasn't just about a necklace. It was about standing firm in the face of subtle discrimination. Her response teaches us valuable lessons on how to navigate challenges with grace, confidence, and conviction. Know your rights. Karoline didn't react emotionally. She asked a simple but powerful question. Is this against policy? In life, whether it's in the workplace, public spaces, or personal interactions, understand your rights. Knowledge is power, and when you stand on truth, others cannot manipulate you. Stay composed under pressure. She remained calm, letting the situation unfold while maintaining control. Emotional outbursts often give power to the aggressor. Instead, when faced with unfair treatment, stay composed, let the facts speak for themselves, and watch as the truth prevails. Courage inspires others. Notice how once Karoline stood her ground, others followed. The businessman, fellow passengers, even the airline's captain. All of them saw the injustice and spoke up. When you stand for what's right, you give others the courage to do the same. The power of accountability. The flight attendant never expected to be held accountable. But in today's world where truth spreads fast, people must be responsible for their actions. Stand firm, document injustices, and let the truth shine. Ultimately, never compromise your values just to make others comfortable. Respect should be mutual, and faith, like dignity, is not up for debate.